Welcome everyone to our very first Academy Software Foundation Careers in Film and Technology webinar. I'm Rachel Rose. I'm an R&D supervisor at Industrial Light and Magic, where I help develop technology that brings movies to life. I'm also an active member of the Academy Software Foundation, which you're going to actually learn a lot about in today's presentations. Now, we're excited that you've joined us today to kick off this webinar series. The series is aimed at helping students who are interested in film and technology, like yourselves, get an inside look at technical careers in visual effects and animation. Today's webinar is just the first of 6 that you will be able to join in on. Tonight's presentations will provide an overview of how open source software is used every day to make movies. Each of the following 5 webinars in the series will highlight engineers and technologists who have made a career within the industry. So you'll get to learn about the day-to-day of people actually working in these jobs. You'll hear more about their paths, and you'll actually get practical advice on how to progress through your own career. After today's, the next webinar is going to be next week, so you won't have to wait very long to hear more. And then there's going to be a new one every other week until the end of April. Now, the webinars are always on the same day of the week, on Thursday, and at the same time this time. So if you haven't already, take a quick look at the rest of the series after tonight's presentation and make sure you're all signed up. Now, like I said, today's webinar will provide an overview of how open source software is used to make movies. Christina, Rob, and I will give some background and history on open source software, discuss how open source software affects movie making, and talk about the role of the Academy Software Foundation to film and technology. Now, there will be a Q&A after our presentation that will be moderated by Carol Payne of Netflix. So if you think of any questions at all that you would like to ask throughout the presentations, please just drop the question into the Q&A panel that's accessed at the bottom of your screen. Carol will be using these questions during the Q&A, so she can ask questions that you're all interested in getting the answers to. So with that, I want to invite Christina to join me on screen. There we go. So Christina is a senior tools programmer at Epic Games, where she works on the Unreal Engine. She is also a member of the Academy Software Foundation Technical Steering Committee for OpenEXR. Additionally, she has been a member of the Academy Scientific and Technical Awards Digital Imaging Subcommittee, which investigates technologies being considered for Academy Awards. Now, previously, she worked in research and development roles in visual effects companies, working on the Matrix sequels, among other movies. Take it away, Christina.
Okay, just getting my slides up here. So I'm going to give you an introduction to what open source software is, and then also talk about the history a little bit, or quite a bit. So open source software refers to software for which the license grants the reuse research, sorry, I can't see my slides here. Oh, here, the right to use, research, and redistribute the source code. And this is there's another term called free software, which uses similar licenses that pretty much grant all the same rights, but it has a different underlying ideology. And there, free emphasizes freedom and not the price. And so it kind of has a whole philosophical underpinning that open source does not. So you'll often hear these terms, these two terms used with an umbrella acronym, which is FOSS, and that covers both of them. So originally, back in the 50s and 60s, software was developed in a collaboration between academic and corporate researchers, and the software and source code were usually provided along with the hardware, well, almost always provided with the hardware. So all source code was provided for the software. And then this started to change in the early 70s. The industry started shifting toward having proprietary commercial software. And this was for people who worked in academia, this was a real shift. And so there was Unix at the time was released in the early 70s. It was developed at AT&T Bell Labs by Ken Thompson and Dennis Ritchie. And it was free, but it wasn't redistributable. So universities could use it and modify it, but they couldn't redistribute it. One example of early open source software or free software was Tech, which was a typesetting software developed by Donald Knuth, who wrote the the Art of Computer Programming books, and he developed it because the first edition of his book had been set in a particular format, and when he got the second edition of the book, it didn't have the same font because it was using new software. And he so disliked the font that he just wrote his own typesetting software. And that's now still used. The derivatives of that software, such as LaTeX, are still used predominantly in university for typesetting books and typesetting research papers and such. But the real kind of foundation of open source software was at MIT. And there was a program at MIT, a staff programmer named Richard Stallman. And they had an issue with, they had a printer that was used by one of their research labs that tended to jam. And so he rewrote the printer driver, and it would stack up a backlog of print jobs. And so he took the source code of the printer driver and rewrote it to basically splat out a message to everybody, hey, the printer's jammed, come fix it. And then at some point, the MIT replaced the printer with a newer printer, and the printer driver was proprietary software, and this really incensed him. And then he asked a researcher at another university who he knew had the source code for this software to give it to him. He said, no, I've signed an NDA, I can't give it to you. And this whole idea of proprietary software and NDA, he was completely philosophically opposed to this notion. He thought that all software should be free and modifiable and shared. So this led to the GNU project, and he developed the GNU project in 1983, and the GNU is an acronym that stood for GNU, is a recursive acronym that stood for GNU's not Unix. And the goal of the GNU project was to create a complete Unix compatible software system to essentially replace Unix with something that's free and redistributable and modifiable. And so, and then just after that, he also developed the GNU project developed the Free Software Foundation. It was a nonprofit that was founded to kind of espouse the values and to organize the GNU project. And then part of the Free Software Foundation was that they also eventually in 1989, very importantly, developed the first public license, the GNU public license, which was the first free software license that kind of set forth the licensing status for these open source, for these free software projects. And two of the projects I mentioned here, GCC and GNU Emacs, were some of the software that came out of the GNU project and still to this day are widely used. Or GNU Emacs was a rewrite of an earlier version of Emacs, but those were both open source, important open source projects, software. And so the GNU public license used a license that was referred to as a copyleft license as opposed to a copyright license. And a copyleft license preserves the free status of a work that's subject to copyright. And it also grants the rights to modify and distribute the source code as long as you preserve the same rights for the derivative software, for the software that you modified and distributed. So then in the early 1990s, the GNU project was going really well. They had most of the parts to replace Unix, but they didn't have the kernel. They had a project called Herd, it had stalled and it wasn't going well at all. And a graduate student in Finland, Linus Torvalds, heard about this and decided to try to write the kernel, and that's why he started writing Linux. And Linux, as everyone knows, became a very widely used operating system ultimately. But so with Linux, and then so once it was first released in 1991, but then eventually it was licensed with the GNU public license in 1992 and officially became part of GNU. And so with that Linux kernel, GNU became the first completely free operating system. And then in 1997, there's a very seminal essay that was written, The Cathedral and the Bazaar by Eric S. Raymond. And that was an essay that described the two different styles of free software development. The Cathedral was most of the GNU projects were developed like the Cathedral style, which was a very select amount of developers worked on the project, and then at the release points, the source code was released, but not in between during the development. Versus the Bazaar style, which was what Linux eventually used, and that was that you had many, many different collaborators working all at the same time, developing the source code, not just getting it at specific release points. And the theory behind this that Linus Torvalds believed in was that the more eyes that you had on a project would make the software more robust, would get rid of more bugs. And so It was and it was very successful style. And so this essay was really important to show people in the industry that this kind of software development could work and succeed. And because of the influence of this essay, Netscape decided in 1998 to release Netscape Communicator, which was their internet communication suite, including Netscape Navigator, which was one of the main browsers at the time, as free software. And this was this was the first time a major company had released a piece of their software, released the source code for their software. And so because of this, they, Eric Raymond and some other people who were interested in promoting open source development held a strategy session in Palo Alto to discuss the future direction of free software. And it was at that meeting that Christine Peterson coined the term open source. And Christine Peterson is a lecturer in nanotechnology, and she was at the time the executive director of the Foresight Institute, which promotes nanotechnology. So, and then right after they coined the term, they also founded the Open Source Initiative as a nonprofit that was to promote open source software development to the technology industry. So then in the early 2000s, in 2000, the Linux Foundation was formed, and this is a nonprofit founded to standardize and support Linux. And it also hosts and promotes other open source projects, including all of our own projects and the Academy Software Foundation. And then in 2005, Git was an open source distributed version control management software was developed by originally written by Linus Torvalds and then Junio Hamano and other people. And Git was in response to the fact that Linux used a proprietary distributed version control management software called BitKeeper that a lot of projects used and got a free license for. And then at some point, someone tried to reverse engineer it. And so BitKeeper pulled all the free licenses. So Linus Torvalds said, well, we'll just write our own. And so they wrote Git. And then Git is, and then that led to, in 2008, GitHub, which is an internet hosting service for software development and version control, which we use for the Academy Software Foundation. And that uses Git for its version control management. And then lastly, I just have a slide that's showing, oh, my slide disappeared. I had a slide showing, let's see if I can get back, there it is. And it's showing some of prominent open source software examples. And I'll point out, just jumping down the list, there's Blender, which is 3D content creation is similar to Maya. That's an open source tool. Natron is open source compositing package similar to Nuke. And then OpenEXR and OpenColor.io are two of the first open source projects that came out of the production community, and then OpenVDB, Open Shading Language, OpenQ, and OpenTimeline, all 6 of those fall under the Academy Software Foundation. So I will hand it back to you, Rachel.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Christina, for describing the history of open source and what it is. Next up, I'd like to invite Rob to join me on the screen. So Rob Brado is an Academy Award nominated visual effects supervisor for Solo, a Star Wars story, and he has credits dating back to Independence Day. He serves as Chief Creative Officer of Industrial Light and Magic, where he focuses on both the creative and technology innovation at the Storied VFX company. He chairs the Academy Software Foundation and has previously served as CTO at Sony Pictures and Lucasfilm. So take it away, Rob.
Thank you. Sorry, it took me a minute to find where the unmute button went. You would think after a year of Zooms, I would be able to find the unmute button, but it moved right when I turned on my slides. So thank you so much for having me. I saw a bunch of people saying hello from all over the world. So thank you for those who are up late and up early to attend, and even those who are on the West Coast where it's 5 o'clock. So thank you so much for joining us. So as Christina was talking about, open source software really is everywhere. If you've used a web browser, you've probably used open source software. Firefox is a popular one today by the Mozilla Foundation. Blender is a popular 3D application that's entirely free and open source. One of the first applications that I was surprised to learn was open source is WordPress. And WordPress.org distributes almost all the source code, well, all the source code that goes into the core of WordPress and many other applications on top of WordPress. And I was wondering how they run a business and give away what seems like is their most important asset. So I'm going to talk a little bit about open source in our industry and how it works, both from a technology and a business perspective. So open source is everywhere. These are just some of the areas that the Linux Foundation is involved with and some of the projects inside of the Linux Foundation. And you can see it spans a lot of different industry sectors. We did a survey early in our investigation into how open source was being used in our industry, in the film and entertainment industry. And 84% of the motion picture industry respondents, these are like CTOs and other people who work at these people who are experts in technology, the various studios, they indicate 84% of them are using open source software. I kind of laughed. I suspect the real answer is 100% of them use open source software. Maybe just not everyone knows how much of the software that you're currently using or is actually running on open source. And if you look back over the last 20 years in our industry, Christina highlighted a couple of these projects that have been very impactful in our industry. And they have, in general, at least over the last 20 years, they've all been born out of very generous companies, these sponsoring companies who have created these key open source projects. And they've given them away to the community for the benefit of the entire industry. So the first really notable project that was specific to the visual effects and the film and entertainment industry that got a lot of traction was OpenEXR. And that was back in 2003, sourced out of Industrial Light and Magic, where I actually work today, but I didn't work there then, so I wasn't responsible for this innovation. I was watching that. I was watching what's happening in WordPress and trying to figure out why people were doing this. And you can see there's a lot of other projects that came along. I was actually at Sony when we decided to open source open shading language and open color IO and Alembic that we did in partnership with ILM. And DreamWorks did OpenVDB, following up in 2013. And then later in 2018, that's when we started the process at the SciTech Council, which is a part of the Academy. That the same Academy that gives out Oscars also does a lot in science and technology. We started an investigation in 2018 how we could support this open source industry, because there were so many important components that were coming out of open source that were foundational to our work. And we realized we could maybe even make it more healthy. So one thing you may not be aware of is you can win an Academy Award by writing software. In fact, Rachel, who is hosting today, she has won one of these for her contributions to the industry. And in fact, it looks like one very good way to win an Academy Award is to make a very popular open source library like OpenEXR or OSL, OpenColorIO or OpenVDB. Some of the engineers who worked on those projects actually have Academy Awards. These are SciTech Achievement Awards, which are certificates and extremely sought after in the industry. And there's a beautiful ceremony and a fantastic plaque or certificate to go with it. And it is part of the Academy's mission to honor both the science and the art of filmmaking. So there are times where you want to keep a certain process or a technique a secret, right? As a business, you understand all these companies that are making movies are working in the movie business, but proprietary tools do have a cost. In fact, they have some very specific areas that you have to bear. You have to pay the cost of developing the application, of course, actually writing the code for the first time. But that also includes all of the maintenance and the third-party integrations. So it's fairly unusual today to write a package that would do everything, right? So you're going to integrate with Maya or Houdini or some of these other packages. Maybe you're going to integrate it with Blender. And every time there's a new version, you have to update your software to tie into that version. So you have your development costs, your maintenance costs. You have to write documentation. You need to train the people who are going to be using these tools. So all of these things, if you are making a proprietary tool, you have to bear all these costs for each of these different tools. And in a complicated environment like the ones we run at ILM, you might have hundreds of these tools. So one of the real big advantages, one of the things that I realized was a draw for a commercial company to participate in an open source community is that these ecosystems that grow up around these open source packages, they actually share those costs. So you share the development costs, you share the maintenance costs, because let's say Autodesk comes out with a new version of Maya, they may already know what the changes are going to be to your very popular open source library that integrates with Maya, and they might just contribute the changes for you automatically, or maybe another one of your users might contribute those changes. The same thing with documentation. You can have user updated documentation. The community can participate. And of course, training materials and other things can develop inside the community. You don't have to do it all within your own organization. It's also very professionally satisfying for developers to work on open source software. Oftentimes software developers who are in these big companies, they may not be able to get screen credits. They may not be able to get some of the other things that the most prominent positions on a film get. But to be able to work on something like an open source project that is externally visible, that can be seen by their peers in the industry, that's very desirable. It's also from a business perspective, it's also nice when someone's going to be checking your work, when you're going to open source your work and anyone can check the code. As an engineer, you're probably going to write your very best code because that work is going to be on display. You're going to probably have to answer questions in the forums about it. You're probably going to write better code. So I firmly believe that when people are working on an open source project, they probably write some of the best code of their career. Another thing is open source really does push forward innovation. What you saw on that slide when I looked back over the last 20 years, these are projects that have pushed the industry forward. And most of them, I think everyone on that list, became an industry standard, which is pretty amazing that the whole industry would adopt it and then use it for interchange and to accelerate innovation. And there's a bunch of different ways listed here on this slide that really shows how you minimize fragmentation, how it's easier for other people to adopt and trust your standard or your library or your tool if it's given away for free and people can modify it. There's a whole bunch of things that really push forward innovation. That's certainly a high priority for a lot of people who contribute to open source. So we already had all these open source projects that were going pretty well. Why did we need a software foundation at all? So why the Academy Software Foundation? Well, it turns out there were some issues that are much harder to solve with individual sponsors, even these really good, well-meaning individual sponsors, a lot harder to solve individually than they were if we all got together. So these companies were all happily getting along, but even just simple things like getting everyone together to work on a single legal framework, especially at competing companies, that's pretty hard to manage when you have 20 or 30 individual companies to get everybody in the room and do this. So there were a bunch of things we could do and coordinate as an Academy Software Foundation and solve some problems. So a legal framework, what does this mean even? Some of it's as simple as the licenses that you agree to when you use the software, or the license that you have to, or the certification you have to give when you want to contribute to the software. It's also just the simple mechanism of putting something out in the world might invite legal critique or people asking questions. And if you do this in the form of a foundation, the way the foundation is set up, we try to minimize any risk that's for the participants in that way. Continuous integration and build infrastructure. This is, the way you actually make the software and make a change and are able to redistribute a new version. Of course, everyone has to build this, but in the form of a foundation, we can do all that work once, and then everybody's systems can work on a similar build system and a similar testing infrastructure. Of course, we haven't achieved the Shangri-La of one perfect license or one perfect build system, but we are a lot closer today than we were just a couple of years ago now that we have the Academy Software Foundation. And then the last one was really providing a neutral forum. A neutral forum could sound a little bit boring, but it's really important. When, let's say ILM, who created OpenEXR, when they are deciding whether or not to take a contribution from a competitor, they might have conflicting motivations. They might be motivated to wait a little bit longer to accept that change because they have other priorities internally, which was actually a very common problem. Or they might not actually need that feature for themselves. And that ILM might have to look at everything they have to do on their plate and say like, well, that's a useful feature for some folks, but we're not going to leverage it. So we may not even have time to process the pull request, do any debugging, update the documentation and push this out. But now that there's an Academy Software Foundation, there's a number of voices at the table. And it's not just a matter of one commercial company being motivated by their own commercial interests about what things to prioritize. It's a whole team of people in this foundation that can provide a neutral forum and try to do the best thing for the library, the best thing for the industry. So it's pretty exciting. Oh, the last one, versionitis. And this is a pretty complicated one. And there had been some progress made by the Visual Effects Society Technology Committee with regards to the way we version our operating system and some of our core libraries that everyone relies on. But versionitis, in short, is the problem of you've got all this great free software out there, but to make it work together and to be compatible with each other, you need some synchronization. You need people using shared libraries that are compatible with each other. And that is quite difficult to synchronize when you have lots of different libraries and no central organization to try to keep that as organized as possible. So the Academy Software Foundation is an open source foundation developed in partnership between the Academy, the same people who give out the Oscars every year, and the Linux Foundation. And it's been very, very successful. We formed it just over 2 years ago in May of 2018. That is just over 2 years ago, yes. And we had a number of amazing founding members. And then we started adopting projects as some of the members and other folks in the community would submit their projects to the Academy Software Foundation. We can actually adopt the projects, bring them in, make sure they're in a healthy state or help them get to a healthy state, and then graduate them to active status inside of the Academy Software Foundation. So you can see OpenVDB, I'll talk about these projects later, but OpenVDB, OpenColor.io, OpenEXR and OpenQ, OpenTimeline.io, Open Shading Language. These are all projects now that are part of the Academy Software Foundation, either in adoption status, meaning they're just getting started, or that are fully adopted already into the foundation. These are our current members. We started with, I think, about 20, and now we have over 30 members. And these are member organizations who actually put money into sponsoring the Academy Software Foundation. So why would you pay for free software? Well, all of these organizations, they were already contributing a lot to open source software and leveraging a lot of open source software. And the value proposition or the argument for putting some money into the Academy Software Foundation is if this foundation exists, it will be more efficient for you to leverage the software that you are reliant on for your productions. It'll be more efficient than if you have to stand this up on your own. Just the build infrastructure alone could be a significant savings because you can just, everything we do in the Academy Software Foundation, you can just download and use in your own organization. So the premier members are putting in a lot of money. The general members are putting in a little bit of money. The associate members are joining. Those are nonprofit organizations who join without any expense. And we get all this group together to coordinate and to act on behalf of open source software for our industry. And just to be clear, you don't have to pay to use the software. You don't have to pay to participate in the development of the software. This is open to everyone. So it's a very inclusive effort. What is our mission? Our mission is to increase the quality and the quantity of open source software for our industry. And we're doing it by a few ways. Establishing a governance model. This is how you decide how the projects are going to proceed. So everyone knows who you have to convince if you want to change something in a software package. A legal framework. This is exactly what it sounds like, getting all the lawyers to agree and be happy that this is going to be accessible software that everyone can use. Christine did a lot of talking about the different flavors of open source software that is out there. Our flavor in the Academy Software Foundation is software you can use in a very permissive way that's compatible with commercial use. So where some of you may be familiar with some of these software licenses that they call viral in nature, which means if you use it, you kind of have to open source your whole system. We use a more permissive system that lets you use it. Even if you're using it in a commercial package, we don't mind. So that's the legal framework we've adopted. And then the community infrastructure, that was what I was talking about how we host our software, how we can change it, how you can update it, build it, and redistribute it to make it easier for more people to participate in developing and using open source software. So those are some of our goals. Create that neutral forum, provide that continuous integration environment, the environment where you can make a change and see it instantly. Give away our build configurations, our scripts, our recipes, and make it really clear how to participate. If you want to make a change in some package that everyone uses in the whole world, we should make it really clear how you can do that. And actually you can. We talked a little bit about more consistent licensing. We also have working groups, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But these are teams of people that get together to explore new, larger projects or other initiatives that we think would be good for our industry. And one of those initiatives is improvements in diversity and inclusion, particularly in these technical roles, and really helping to raise the profile of software engineers and how important people with technical skills like that are for our industry. But this isn't just about people who are experts at coding. Of course, it includes you. If you're an expert coder, you're in the right spot. If you're not, if you're just a fan of visual effects, you're a fan of using the software, if you like to write documentation, you like to participate in submitting bugs or testing software, there's roles for everyone in these projects. I won't go into too much detail about this because I think you might want to know about some of the projects, but the way we actually work, a large part of the work happens on the Technical Advisory Council. That's that big box in the middle. And this is representatives from each of the projects, representatives from each of the sponsoring companies run the TAC. It's a group that meets at least once a month, and they go through and they make sure all the projects are healthy, that they have the right resources. They make recommendations about the way to adopt new projects and the way to support projects that'll support our industry. The governing board, they're on the left. They basically take care of the money and the governance, make sure we have enough money to accomplish what the TAC wants to make happen, and set other vision and goals as well. And the outreach committee helps organize events like this so we can talk to people and make sure anybody who wants to participate feels welcome to join. And really, anyone can participate. You can participate in any of the individual projects. You can join a TAC meeting anytime you'd like. So anyone can participate in any aspect of this. So this is a great way to get your foot in the door in the industry if you'd like to mix with some of the people who are working on some of your favorite films right now. I mentioned earlier, open source is everywhere. If you look at this landscape we have, which you can look at landscape.aswf.io or even l.aswf.io, you can see all of the projects, or all the projects we're aware of that people are using that are open source in our industry, who's supporting them, what their latest version is, all that kind of thing. These 6 projects, which I'll go through quickly to make sure we have plenty of time for questions at the end, and feel free to submit your questions. I see some are already coming in. We have 6 projects that are adopted into the Academy Software Foundation, and we're growing. We're going to have more soon. But each one of them serves a specific function for movie making. OpenBDB is a volumetric library. This allows us to store the data that goes into simulations like water simulations and fire and smoke sims in a very efficient format, and visit it and manipulate that data. So you get these things like this scene out of How to Train Your Dragon in the upper right-hand corner, or from The Croods in the upper left. It was originally developed at DreamWorks Animation and contributed to the Academy Software Foundation as our very first project, actually. And now you can see in the lower right, now we have contributions from all sorts of people working in all areas of the industry. OpenColor.io handles a very important problem, which is making sure what you see on the screen color-wise is exactly what you expect. And the way we work on films is we work in a color space that is designed to give us accurate results. It's often called a linear color space. So it's a mathematically accurate color space that the math can all work properly, but then you need to transform that into something that we'll look at, and it'll look just like it. It'll look the same whether you're looking at it on a monitor or on film, or in a DI suite where we would finish the films in post-production. OpenColor.io takes care of all the math and handles all the libraries, so we can do that very, very consistently across all of the different packages. So OpenColor.io is used in all sorts of applications across our industry. The nice thing is OpenColor.io version 2 is coming very soon, or has just been released, and is very exciting. It does a bunch of new things that we couldn't do in version 1. And it's also really a great story because OpenColor.io was originally written at Sony ImageWorks, and some of the key developers have since left our industry. And OpenColor.io 2 has really largely been taken. It's been a lot of contributors. There's been a lot of people who participated, but Autodesk, one of the commercial software providers in our industry, has done just a lot of heavy lifting and really led the development of OpenColor.io version 2. If there hadn't been an Academy Software Foundation, I mean, that could have happened. It's open source. Anyone could have taken it and changed it, but I think it's less likely. And it was really enabled by everyone coming together and saying, oh, this really is what it needs to be. And Autodesk helped take the lead on making that happen, along with a lot of other contributors. OpenQ is a rendering scheduling program. So when you have hundreds of computers and you've got tens of thousands of frames to get rendered, how do you make sure everything gets scheduled out, whether it's computers you have on your local network or computers you have in the cloud? How do you make sure all that work gets done in a timely and efficient way, leveraging all of your machines to their best capacity? And this was originally developed at ImageWorks, and then ImageWorks and Google worked together to make this open source project that is now being incubated inside of the Academy Software Foundation. OpenEXR, one of the oldest open source libraries in our industry. This is a image format, a way to store images like a PNG or a TIFF or even a PSD file. This is a way to store high dynamic range images, so you can see all the details in the blacks, and even things you can't see are still stored accurately in the file. And you can see all the details in the highlights. And now there isn't a frame, I don't think, that is done on a movie that isn't touched by this format. So this is one of the oldest projects, and it was the third or fourth project invited or adopted into the Academy Software Foundation. Definitely a fantastic home for it. And we've seen a lot of new work happening in OpenEXR since its adoption into the foundation. Open Timeline IO was created at Pixar, and with the goal of taking all the timeline editing information that happens on a film and having a format to bring that in, so you can do things like move an edit from an Avid down to an artist's desk and push out to another editing system if you need to, and keep all the changes in sync and be able to be reviewed anywhere. It is a fantastic library, still in public beta, and it's one of the newer projects in the industry and in our foundation, but it solves a very specific and important problem and is getting a lot of adoption, has a lot of active development right now. Open shading language. What is this? This is a programming language that we use in the industry to write shaders, and shaders are the things that that help us calculate the lighting calculations, or calculate the actual color of an object, including the lighting, inside of a rendering system. So it's really the place you go to define the math of how everything's going to look in your movie. And there's lots of different ways to describe that. And open shading language is one of those programming languages that has evolved to solve those problems. And it is very powerful. It is very fast. It's very flexible, and it's used in a lot of different rendering systems now, and has had contributions from across the industry. This one is also contributed by Sony ImageWorks. Okay, so that was a lot of projects to go through, but I wanted to make sure you got a sense of the kind of breadth and the number of different places that our projects are touching. One of the most exciting things that has been a part of the Academy Software Foundation from the beginning, but has really gotten a lot of energy more recently, and thanks to Rachel and Carol and some of the other people on our foundation really pushing this forward, is our diversity and inclusion working group. Truly, this is one of the best ways to get onboarded in the industry around open source. And we really want to make sure that people see this as an on-ramp into our business. This quote, I think, is very accurate, which is part of our mission statement for the D&I working group. Open source has the power to break down racial, gender, and corporate barriers to unite people around a shared goal. And I recommend you take a look at that page on our homepage. This is something that the governing board and everyone in the Academy Software Foundation is very behind, making sure that we make it easy for you to participate in open source, participate in the development of the things that drive our industry, and we would love to have you here. When I look at this as a problem that we want to solve for the industry, it's for many reasons. It's the right thing to do, to give people equal opportunity to join our industry. And we haven't been great at this. We have ground to make up for sure. And when I look at that, when I look at people that we have missed, what I see is missed opportunities. There are people who haven't gotten a chance to get that interview at that job, or haven't gotten a chance to work on these films, who would like to have those chances, or who didn't even know they could. And we want to go out and broadcast and make sure you can get your foot in the door. You can participate. And if we don't do a good job at that, we're just missing great, highly qualified, highly capable individuals. And we have been as an industry. So we're going to do everything we can to amplify that message at the Academy Software Foundation and try to bring that message home. So lots of ways to get your foot in the door. We can definitely talk about this in the Q&A, but there are a lot of different ways to contribute. You can see this list here. You can jump onto GitHub. If you see a mistake, it can be as simple as a typo. You can make a change, submit your change, and have it included in the software that people are using on all of these films. You could submit test cases. You can work on documentation. You can join the discussion list and get a sense of a project that you're interested in getting involved with. You can join in. You could also just join one of the TAC or one of the working groups. If you're interested in diversity and inclusion as a project to help accelerate our attraction of people to our industry, you could join that working group, and we would love to have you for sure. And you could do that via mailing list. You can do that by attending the meetings or watching some of the recordings. Here's different ways to connect with us. Hopefully we've picked your favorite social media and different places you can join. Free to join any of these things, free to participate, free to be a part of any of this. And in case you didn't see, yeah, here's the mailing list where you can join in on the mailing lists. There are quite a few different ones, so you can find one that interests you there and get connected to us. So thank you so much for letting me take a few minutes of your time. I know I'm going to hand back to Rachel, who I think has a few things to do before we jump into answering your Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rob. I'm going to share my screen again. So let me find the right button. Great. So I just want to talk a little bit more about diversity and inclusion because this is such an important topic for the Academy Software Foundation and hopefully for everyone that is here and kind of where all of our thoughts are at the moment around all of this. So since open source software is only as good as its community, the Academy Software Foundation has really gotten behind this idea of pushing forward diversity and inclusion. We've really decided to take the might of our members to move the needle on this problem of lack of diversity. So it was this past summer that the foundation formed the new diversity and inclusion working group that Carol Payne of Netflix, who's going to be moderating our Q&A, and I signed on to co-chair. Now, while issues of diversity within software development or the VFX industry are not going to change overnight, the Academy Software Foundation is in a unique position to provide much needed resources for engagement. Now, as we said in the press release that we put out in June, we really want to be a catalyst for this change. And we want to bring in as many people as we possibly can into this space. Now, it's important to note that like all of the open source projects, as Rob mentioned, all of our working groups are also completely open to anyone who wants to join. So our active members within the Diversity and Inclusion Working Group include software engineers and developers. We have artists, we have marketing and communication professionals, we have talent recruiters, managers, and professors and students just like yourselves. So anyone can join in the meetings and help us push towards our goals. And you've probably seen several people in the chat mentioning that they're new members of the group and have been very welcomed. And that's something that we really want to continue in our group. So speaking of goals, I want to speak a little bit about the diversity and inclusion goals that we do have for our working group at the moment. The first is to ensure that the Academy Software Foundation itself has a diverse leadership and membership across the foundation and all of its projects. We want to see diversity within our organization itself. Second, we also want to provide guidance and resources for Academy Software Foundation members on topics that are related to diversity and inclusion. So far, this has included developing a great new blog series that covers diversity and inclusion topics that are written by members of the working group. This blog series, again, is completely open and available to anyone. So I really suggest that you take a look at the Academy Software Foundation website and look into the blog and see some of the posts that we're making based around diversity and inclusion and see if there's anything that rings true or helps you learn about this topic in a new way. And finally, our last goal for the working group is one that I think you will all find quite interesting. And that is that we want to find ways to inform students like yourselves of technical career opportunities in the industry. Now, this goal is actually what led us to develop this webinar series, and that's why we're all sitting here today. We are also working on developing an internship program to help bring college students to the Academy Software Foundation projects and provide a clear path for being able to contribute as people are, learning computer science in school. We're also working on developing a scholarship program that will combine online learning courses with Academy Software Foundation mentorship to help push towards our goal of student education around these types of technical careers in our industry. So we'll have a lot more on those initiatives as we continue to push on them, but you can join now and become a part of planning out these great programs. Now, open source directly embraces the idea that computer science is only enhanced by working with others with diverse views. And those views can come from anyone, including you, just as Rob pointed out. So if you are looking for practical ways to progress your career and have an interest in technical innovation and the science behind the film industry, which I'm assuming you do since you're listening to me now, I encourage you to tune in to the rest of the webinar series, but I also suggest you look deeper into the Academy Software Foundation and its projects. So I once again have a couple of the ways in which you can get involved. In particular, here is a place where you can sign up for any of our mailing lists and or also join our new students channel in Slack, where we hope to build a student community of people that can exchange ideas. You know, in the Academy Software Foundation, you really have a place where you can learn from some of the most talented technologists in the industry and where you have the chance to collaborate on software that makes movie magic possible. So where are we going with the webinar series? Well, our next one is next week, as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, and it will focus in on software engineers in our industry. It's going to feature 3 speakers, Bridget Powell and Trina Roy, who will both be talking about their experiences as software engineers in the industry. And then Karen Ruggles, a professor who will be discussing some of the career growth opportunities you may have in school to maybe go into a career like software engineering for the film industry. So I highly recommend that you try to dial in for that next week. I'm personally very excited to hear all of these ladies' stories. So it's time for the Q&A, but before that, I just want to take a moment to say a really big thank you to the whole Academy Software Foundation Diversity and Inclusion Working Group for getting this webinar series off the ground, but especially to Karen Ruggles, Emily Olin, and Carol Payne, who really pushed to put this whole thing together. So thank you very much. And if now all the rest of the speakers want to join me, as well as Carol Payne, who will be moderating, that would be great.
Awesome. Thanks, Rachel. Really excited to see everybody here, and thank you for all the awesome questions in the Q&A. I'm going to do my best to kind of get through them, and our panelists will do their best to answer kind of a speed round, as you will. But what Rachel said is, if you don't get your question answered, don't feel like it's because we chose not to or we didn't want to. We might run out of time. Ask it in the Slack channel or on the mailing lists and stay in touch. We want to answer all of your questions. We just have about 12 minutes to do so. So here we go. There's a couple questions around what an aspiring applicant can do, someone who wants to get in the industry could do right now if they don't go to a film school, a prestigious school that has programs related to directly that might feed into something like this. And I'll leave this open for anybody who wants to take it.
I'll give a quick answer, and then I don't know if Christina wants to jump in too, but I think these projects are a really good way to get exposed to leading technologists in the industry, and it's completely open to you whether you go to a prestigious university or not, or even if you don't have any access to any schooling, but you're interested in some of these areas and you want to develop your skills. It's a great place to do it. There's code, like getting your code reviewed by somebody who's been working in this industry for 15, 20 years. That's an opportunity that might not have been available to anybody who had the interest without something like open source. So you could look at any of these projects, participate in it, and you're going to be communicating with people who are working professionally in the industry with these projects. And you'll find out if you love it. And if you do, you'll get better at it, which will be a fantastic way to get recruited in the industry. Certainly one of the places we look when we're looking for engineers is the people who've been already working on projects that we use every day.
Awesome. Yeah. And I also think that this webinar is a great place to start. This webinar series, learn about the careers, learn about what your options are. There's stuff that when I started in the industry, I didn't know existed and have learned along the way. So we're going to do our best to pass on that knowledge. Christina, did you have anything else to add, or should we?
Yeah, I was going to add, if you do look at the specific projects, on each project, there's a list of issues that are issues that we want to tackle for the software. So sometimes it's useful to kind of glance through some of those and see if, you know, something looks approachable for you, or you might want to take a look at that. Everybody on the Academy Software Foundation and on the various steering committees for the projects is really welcoming. So, you know, if you just want to, I wouldn't be afraid to kind of make that effort to just try to address an issue if you see one that interests you.
Yeah, I would also,
Awesome.
I'll add one other thing to everything that both Rob and Christina and Carol have said. And that's that one of the things that we're really looking for when we interview new people, especially people that are just coming out of school, is showing of initiative, right? And being involved in something like the Academy Software Foundation or an independent project that you've gotten really excited about and really pushed to the extreme. That is the type of thing that catches people's attention. So, you know, it's both the ability to interact with people that are in the industry and doing this job that you'll get to learn from on a day-to-day basis, but also showing, you know, a future employer that you have a lot of drive and excitement in this space.
Awesome. And on that note, the next couple of questions are around, so you want to get started. What are the most common tools that projects in the ASWF use, the common programming languages and things like that? Christina, I don't know if you want to give us a couple examples.
Well, so C++ and it is the main one used by, I think, all of the projects, and to some degree Python too in some of the projects. So those are definitely the main languages you would want to use. There are needs that have to do with, you know, continuous integration and what else can I add to that? There's documentation needs. There's, you know, there's more than just programming needs on some of the projects. And I forgot to mention when I mentioned the issues, those are in the GitHub repository for each project. There's a list of issues. So to be more clear, there's a tab that says issues. But yeah, I think that covers.
Awesome. Yeah. And another question that I like that sort of is along some of these lines is, Jason wants to know how each of you got into the motion picture industry. What drove you to enter it, and what's kept you around in the engineering field? And he notes he's from Australia and might not have access, like we're talking about, to a lot of the things that you might have in California.
So I can jump in there. Oh,
please do.
I'll jump in really quick and just say, you know, from a very young age, I was always really interested in the entertainment industry. It was just something that drove me. I almost thought I wasn't going to end up doing entertainment because when I got into college and decided that I wanted to try to do computer science, I realized I had fallen in love with computer science. I found it to be a very social subject, and it was something that really drew me to that. And you know, the collaboration with other people was something that was very exciting to me. So I decided at the end of my undergrad to continue my career in graduate school, and I thought at that point that I wasn't going to be able to do things in the entertainment industry anymore, and how wrong I was, right? When by the time I got to graduate school, I realized there was this whole field called computer graphics that fit in with exactly both my desire to be working in entertainment and doing that sort of art, while at the same time really pushing on my love of computers. So it was kind of, I fell into it, and my first job was ILM. So I've been there ever since I finished my PhD and love it.
I'll just answer briefly. My background was computer science and radio, TV, film, and I really knew that I wanted to do a mix of those two. Once I realized that there were people doing computer graphics full time, I knew that that's what I wanted to work on. I started making cable television commercials with a package, this will date me, but we're using Wavefront, which is a package that hasn't been used in a lot of years, but it's a 3D animation tool. I think at the time I was using a 160 $60,000 computer and software combination. So it was a lot less accessible than it is today, where you can run it pretty much on any computer and you can download Blender for free. So if you have a computer, you can do 3D graphics. And that computer that you have at home is faster than the computer that I started on by a huge margin. It has a lot more memory and a much better graphics card. So yeah, so I've been excited, and I've kind of branched between doing technology work and doing supervising work on the artistic side. And I've loved being in both worlds.
So I come from a kind of different background. I studied architecture as an undergrad, but architecture, like buildings architecture, and went into fashion and PR out of school and hated it. And then I ended up finding a job with Anderson Consulting, where they taught you to program. And I had done a Myers-Briggs test, so I had a feeling I was going to like engineering, and I've been good at math, so I decided like I'm going to do that, and I loved programming. So I programmed in the consulting world for a number of years, but I just knew I wanted to get deeper into it. And I ended up finding a program at Berkeley that let me come back and take all the undergrad classes in computer science there, effectively the undergrad major. And I knew, based on my background in architecture, that I probably wanted to do computer graphics. So the first day I was at Berkeley, I looked down the list of professors and found one who taught computer graphics, and marched into his office and said, "I can program, can I volunteer?" And he took me down to his grad students, and I started volunteering, and they taught me computer graphics, and really, and so then out of school, at that time, a lot of his grad students worked at Silicon Graphics, with the company that's, I think, no longer around. They made all the computers that everyone at ILM used back in the day, Jurassic Park and whatnot. And so out of school, I went to work for them on graphics APIs, and then I had friends who were working in the film industry, and it looked so fun. And so I ended up moving over from doing graphics APIs over to working on films, doing R&D kind of things. And then gradually now I work in games, which a former visual effects colleague recruited me into games. But yeah, that's I kind of did a very nonlinear path. So my advice is be bold and ask people, things like just going into that professor's office one day opened so many doors for me that I can't even imagine if he hadn't accepted me as someone to program for his grad group. It just changed my whole career. So
I probably used your APIs on Independence Days. If you were at SGI, were you writing like IrisGL graphics API stuff?
You did not, because I worked on a bunch of APIs that never released, like OpenGL.
Oh.
The Scene Graph API became Fahrenheit, that then got smashed by Microsoft. So I did work I did some work on Performer. I did some work on Cosmo 3D. So I did some bug fixes and stuff on those, but unfortunately the ones I worked on never got released. So. But I was with the group that did OpenGL and Mark Segal and all those people.
Nice.
So, yeah.
That's awesome. I think that that's one of my favorite things about this industry is, it's both very big and very small. And that, you make connections all the time that you didn't before. And there's a couple other questions in the chat. We're running a little short on time, but I think we can summarize. There's one that's on how can international students best get into the industry? Can you still get into the industry if you're not studying a related field? And I really just want to highlight that everything that we're talking about in this webinar is the answer to that question, and it is yes. And we really feel strongly that open source is a fantastic way to do that. So I want to encourage all of you to, get involved and look around and see what's out there. And yeah, I think to end with that, I think if our panelists have advice for the best way to jump into, say you see a project and something that interests you, what are the next steps? How would you go about getting to know the people that work on the project and contributing?
Well, Christina gave great advice in terms of jumping into the GitHub, looking at the outstanding bugs and the things on the task lists. That's fantastic. But join the mailing list of a group and see what the tone of that is, what the questions are. Ask questions, participate, join in to know some of the people there, and try to get a sense of how you can help, how you can contribute. That would be a fantastic way. And it's absolutely open, as Carol said, to everyone internationally. We're in 5 countries just at ILM, and we're just one of the companies here. Netflix, I think, is in every country and hires people all around the world. I think someone said they're in Australia. We just opened our studio in Sydney. So, and Epic has engineers. You guys have engineers all over the world, right, Christina?
Yes.
Yeah, I would also recommend joining one of the meetings. So all of the projects have meetings, all of the working groups have meetings, the TAC that, kind of organizes all of this and pushes forward on the technical aspects of our projects, have meetings. All of them are open. You can just dial in and you don't even have to necessarily turn on your camera if you don't want to. If you just want to join and turn off your camera and sit back and listen, it's a great way to get used to the conversation and start to know some of the players in the mix, and then also join in when you feel comfortable. So I definitely recommend trying that out sometime.
And then you can join the Slack channels. I think some are more active than others, but there are Slack channels for each of the projects as well. So
All really great advice. And we're just about at time, but I want to give our panelists a chance if there's any last thoughts that you'd like to share with the group before we sign off.
I would just mention it's a growth industry. There's more films, more series being made. Netflix alone is famously making billions of dollars worth of shows, and Disney is making billions of dollars more content than we were the year before. And that's kind of true across the industry. So that means more visual effects, more need for people who have both technical backgrounds and artistic backgrounds to dive in and help us make this stuff. So we want to find you, especially if you feel like it's a little harder to get into because you don't have that direct connection. We want to help make those on-ramps.
I very much agree. Awesome. Thanks everybody for attending. Reminder that we have our first careers webinar next Thursday, same time, same place, which is your home or wherever you're dialing in from. And we'll see you all then, and also on Slack and email. Have a great night or day or whatever time it is where you are.
bye, thank you.